How's it going, and welcome to No Fun Allowed's guide series on the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, a 5th edition module. In today's video, we'll be going over the overview of Thither and all of the forested goodness therein. Of course, there's going to be a ton of spoilers, so players don't watch this, but DMs don't want that added insight. Go ahead and stick around because there's a lot to cover here. So here we are, Chapter 3, Thither. Your players have finally done it. What is it? Well, that entirely depends on your campaign. Your players may have beaten up Bavlorna and are now chasing her down to Thither. Your players may be working for Bavlorna, in which case they must go to Thither. Or your players have subverted some sort of expectation and somehow gotten a guide to get them to Thither to go on to the next adventure. Now, Thither, much like Hither, has a sort of set track in which, as your players arrive in the area, they go to these preset destinations, and you can throw in the random encounters in between. But of course, you can change it up. You can make this a hex crawl if you want. You can make this a point crawl where they can choose whichever direction they go. You can do things out of order. But once again, if you do things out of order, they might not necessarily go back to certain good things. And also very important is, if they do not go to Nib's cave first, they may be out on some cool swag. So before we start talking about Thither, let's talk about getting to Thither from Hither. Presumably your players need to get a balloon from Downfall, and what it states there is if there is no balloon at all whatsoever, then a balloon just happens to show up, and your players can take that one and make their way over to Thither, and if they have a trusty guide in the form of Clapperclaw, then they can go their way over there, but it doesn't need to be Clapperclaw, of course. It could be any number of any character that you want, or if you really don't care about that, it could be no guide at all. I do recommend having the guides there because having NPCs float around the party is a great way to have your voice as a DM, but expressed through an NPC, so it's not just, you talking to the players, it's a character talking to the other characters. Also important is the fact that your players are presumably arriving here on balloon, and what I suspect a lot of people are going to think is, oh hey, if we get here by balloon, can we just keep on flying the balloon all over the place? If that is the case, your players might miss out on a bunch if they explore around purely on balloon. If your players go all around the forest, they don't get into any of those random encounters and they just go from one point to the next, then there might be some things lost. And maybe you want your players to explore around on foot, in which case you have to come up with a reason why the balloon doesn't work. Maybe the balloon needs time to recharge, maybe the balloon gets damaged along the way. Maybe your players don't even arrive on balloon. Maybe your players have to actually march through the mountains there. Once again, your own prerogative here. I do recommend, though, that however they get to Thither, that they don't travel around Thither in a balloon, because there is just a lot of fun things to be had on the ground, and if they're in a balloon the whole time, they kind of just jump over a lot of the encounters. So come up with some fun reason why the balloon doesn't work. Maybe the balloon breaks, maybe the balloon's a one-time use, maybe the person that pilots the balloon, maybe it being one of the bullywugs, they say, hey, I can drop you off, but I gotta go right back. I'll catch you guys in a couple of days. And if you want to, of course, keep in line with the theme, you could say that I'll come back in 3 days or 8 days. Now, as you'll be able to tell looking at this map, you can see that there's a whole bunch of these rings with mushrooms. These are the fairy rings. This is the first feature of Thither. These fairy rings were once pure and awesome, but now some of them have been corrupted. And in fact, when your players arrive at one, you roll a d8, and on a 1, 2, or 3, they are corrupted. So when your players make their way to an uncorrupted fairy ring, which is more than likely, they have a decent chance of seeing a bunch of Campestris, because once again you roll a d8, and on a 1 or 2 nothing happens, but on a 3 or higher there's a swarm of Campestris. The Campestris are singing and dancing and having a fun time, and if your players join in on the revelries and make a DC 12 performance check, they will gain the benefit of true seeing for the next 24 hours. So if you don't tell your players what this actually means, then it's not going to mean much. But it is going to be useful later on when your players need to get in touch with a unicorn. What's also really unique about this is, in addition to your players getting the true seeing, which they might need later on, there's also the added benefit of, if your players teach them a new move and make a DC 13 performance check, then they'll be given a Charm of Heroism. Pretty dope stuff. Which, to help you not looking that thing up, is basically a potion of heroism that you can activate at any time, and for 1 hour you gain 10 temp HP. That lasts 1 hour. For the same duration you are under the effect of the Bless spell, no concentration required. Pretty cool. So not only do you get the 10 temp HP, but you also get to add a d4 to all your attacks and saving throws. Pretty dope stuff. So the thing is remember, make sure you checked that tracker of yours, that Witchlight tracker, because if your players did get those singing lessons from Palasha, then they get advantage on this check. So the thing is, though, is while I do like the advantage of this whole thing, there is the sad part of it where even with advantage, your players can still lose. Because it is a DC 13 performance check, and quite frankly, a lot of people don't take proficiency in performance, it's very likely that this doesn't come up. So what I would say is if you are a kind and lenient and generous DM, you could just say, hey, because Palasha gave you those singing lessons, you automatically succeed. You could say that. That's a pretty cool way to go. So much like how we saw in Bavlorna's with the Magical Mirror, we see that there's an activating of the Fate Crossing here, and if your players turn 3 times in Widdershins and off we go, then they could return to the material plane. So once again, this does come into, do you want your players to be trapped in Prismeer, or do you want your players to keep on coming back to Prismeer and saving it? I talked about this before, but once again, just I would say lean in on one or the other. Either have it where they're stuck in Prismeer and there's no way to get out until they save the day, or have it where they come back and every time they go back and forth, then time changes. Either time speeds up or slows down in either the material plane or in Prismeer. And now we also have the Corrupted Fairy Rings. So if you roll that 1, 2, or 3 when your players arrive to any one of them, it is actually corrupted, and Granny Nightshade has cast the Awaken spell on 3d8 plus 60 toadstools that form the ring. And if your players try and do anything in particular with this ring, then all of the little toadstools are going to mock the PCs and be rude and break whatever it is that they're trying to do. Specifically, they're going to break the ring, and they're just going to be mean. If your players do decide to go on a killing rampage, then quite frankly, there's nothing little toadstools are going to be able to do. Killing more than half of the ring's toadstools makes the ring unusable, which it was already going to be unusable anyway because your players are killing them, and also they were just never going to activate anyway, so it is what it is. Now on for the other fun feature of Thither, we have wanted posters. As your players are walking around this place, you should definitely have it where your players are going to see a whole bunch of wanted posters. Who are these wanted posters for? They're for Will of the Feywild, or you could just simply shorten that down to being Will of the Wild. We're going to dive more into Will of the Wild once we get to that named location, but let's take a look at this wanted poster here. So Will of the Wild, in short, is this kid that keeps on running away from Granny Nightshade, and Granny Nightshade wants that kid. So she is offering up a whole bunch of rewards to get Will. So it's very important that as your players walk around here, they see that there is different wanted posters other than the same one. And all these wanted posters are going to have something different. This first one here says, "This sorry wretch is stolen from me. Deliver him to me alive and unarmed, and I'll give you back 10 years of your youth." But here's the thing. You got to be careful what you wish for because the reward isn't always the greatest thing. So every single one of these is pretty fantastic. One of my most favorites being, "Bring me this imp alive and unharmed, and I'll bury you up to your neck in silver." That one's pretty on the nose. Some of these, your players could reasonably be like, oh, maybe she's actually, willing to give that. But if you say specifically bury you up to your neck in silver, people are going to know, okay, she's obviously going to jack you up somehow, right? So the thing to note is that these rewards are true, right? She's not lying. She is definitely going to reward parties for bringing her what she has desired. And there is the possibility that your players do seek these rewards. One of the ones right here being, "Bring him to me alive and unharmed, and I'll grant you a loyal servant." Your players might think themselves, okay, a loyal servant actually does sound pretty cool. Maybe having a dope, NPC on our side would be awesome. It's only a frog companion, but hey, that's pretty cool. So once again, just as your players walking around, make sure that you show off different ones of these, and eventually they should be able to see all 8, and then they can make up their mind on what they want out of a reward if they go down the path of capturing Will. Which I don't suspect a lot of groups will go down that route, but if they do, then at least they might get something out of it. Or what I suspect is some groups might pretend to capture Will and say, "Hey, Will, we're going to turn you over, but then we're going to bust you out." I think that's a more likely outcome. Now on to the arrival in Thither. As mentioned before, there is sort of this point crawl aspect of they suspect that you start off in Nib's Cave and then go to the next location, the next location. It doesn't need to be that way, but starting off in Nib's Cave definitely does help because it does give you players some rewards. But beyond that, it's wherever they want to go, right? So speaking of that, let's talk about those random encounters. Some of these random encounters are great and really flesh out the world. Some of these random encounters aren't the strongest, but let's go over all of them, shall we? The first random encounter we have is Blink Dogs. As your players walk into the scene, they see that there are blink dogs that are sadly holding a funeral for some of their lost companions. So this one is admittedly dark, especially for dog owners. I'm sure this really hits home for them. But as your players walk up, they can see that the Blink Dogs have dug up a crude grave and are burying them now. But the thing is it states that if your players can talk to the Blink Dogs, then your players can, interact with them a bit more. But the problem is, as written, Blink Dogs can speak Blink Dog, and they understand Sylvan but can't speak it. Once again, just pretty much with everything in this whole adventure, I say scrap all that. Either have everything speak Common or have everybody speak Sylvan. Do something along those lines, because having characters that are intelligent but can't interact with the party is totally lame. Should your players approach the scene in a respectful manner, then the Blink Dogs will tell the party a little bit about Loomlurch, about how there's a goblin market there, and the scarecrows will shriek loudly, and how Granny Nightshade has sparrows to communicate with her other sisters. So the thing is while yes, this can be a beautiful yet sad and tragic moment, I know that there's a lot of groups out there that are going to be like, oh, we should, manipulate the Blink Dogs to be on our side or whatever. I say, just let them mourn, let them be. But what I would strongly suggest is, if you have any players that have recently had any of their dogs die, then maybe change this encounter up entirely. Maybe have the Blink Dogs have gotten just beaten up and they're limping away from Granny Nightshades. I think that's a good way to go about it. And then they go to lick their wounds, and you don't have to worry about the whole bearing dog process. Next up for random encounters, we have Buttered Campestri. As your players look around, they see a cauldron that's boiling and a Campestri that's merrily singing, and it's getting all buttered up. And if anybody asks what's going on, the Campestri is going to say, oh yeah, my friend is giving me a bath. The friend in question is Crow-Ah, a goblin who simply, of course, wants to eat said Campestri because it presumably would be a pretty cool mushroom. Once your players catch on to the ruse that's going on here, your players can try and persuade the poor little Campestri to walk away. But if they do not, after several minutes, Crow-Ah reappears and will say, hey, what's going on, gang? Crow-Ah's not going to pick a fight with the party, of course. And if the party stops Crow from eating the mushroom, then they're just going to let bygones be bygones. Should the party ask Crow any questions, Crow can say that there is a goblin market at Loomlurch, and Granny Nightshade puts children to work in her toy shop. So I think that there is a lot more to be had with this goblin and mushroom relationship. I think there's a lot of fun things you can have there. I think that this could be the start of a beautiful tag-along, little party of NPCs that follow the party around, and there could be that mushroom and the goblin wants to eat the mushroom at first, but then as the mushroom talks more and more, maybe Crow finally learns that this intelligent mushroom is much more above being eaten. Or your players could just walk away from the whole situation, and then the goblin's just going to eat more and more mushrooms. Next up for random encounters, we have Centaur. Your players will come across Winterbow, an aged centaur who sadly got left behind by the herd when Prismeer closed. So this poor centaur is extremely slow, only 25 feet compared to what other centaurs I have. I think they're 50. And my goodness, this poor centaur is also going blind and can only see out to 60 feet. So once again, I think this is another great NPC that could potentially tag along with the party. Your players say, hey, it's dangerous out there to go alone. Why don't you come with us? And then your players can have an aged centaur spill out some awesome wisdom. I would definitely lean in on maybe the Harry Potter style approach, where maybe this centaur definitely has seen a lot of things and is willing to talk about the world and the greater astrology of the world and all that fun stuff. There's definitely a lot of great roleplay potential to be had with the centaur, other than your players just getting directions on where to go to Loomlurch and that's it. I think that this centaur would be a great addition to your party as they march along all of Thither. Next up, we have Doomed Dryad. As your players are walking around, then all of a sudden they will see a gnarly tree in which Meadowleaf the Dryad is captured in. Believing the party to be mercenaries of Granny Nightshades, the Dryad points an accusing finger at the party and says, show these villains the true meaning of revenge, and a whole bunch of awakened shrubs are going to attack. Awakened shrubs are absolutely a joke, especially because your players are going to be level 3 or 4 when they arrive here, so it's not going to be that big of a deal. I mean, look at these things. They've got a negative AC, essentially. They've got a +1 to their attack. They've got a -1 to their D4 of damage. They're not going to do anything to the party at all. So hopefully your party recognizes that and says, hey, whoa, slow down here. Let's talk about this. If your party makes a good argument or half of these shrubs are killed, then Meadow Leaf is going to call off the attack. So once your players actually do start to talk to this Dryad, she will regale about her terrible tragedy. She's not going to apologize for attacking because she's a bit too bitter. And I don't blame her. If I was stuck to one gnarly tree in the middle of nowhere, I'd hate it too, right? She's going to urge the party to get Zybilna back into power so that other Dryads don't share in a similar terrible fate. And to help out with that, she's going to give the party 3 Sycamore seeds, and these seeds are essentially Pass Without Trace spells, which is really cool because Pass Without Trace is one of those holdover broken spells giving you +10 to stealth. Absolutely freaking ridiculous. Now, I'm sure your players, if they actually get invested in this little storyline, they may be just adamant about trying to free this poor Dryad. In which case, if your players do strike out hard enough, whether that be using some sort of magical spell or moving the tree itself, or, making Granny Nightshade pay for it, whatever the case may be, there's definitely a way your players could free this Dryad. And I think that your players should be rewarded for that, especially if they do go to Granny Nightshade and make a deal and say, hey, we'll do a quest for you if you free that Dryad. I think that's actually a pretty awesome thing to do. And if your players do free her, then I think that there should be a much greater reward involved. Maybe it could be some sort of magical charm. Maybe it could just be more Pass Without Trace Sycamore seeds. Maybe it could be the party getting loaned a whole bunch of awakened shrubs that they can use for fodder or defense or testing out traps. It could be a whole bunch of fun things. And now on to the random encounter, Grandfather Tree. As your players are walking around, there they see 8 tiny houses in a tree. There they'll see a whole bunch of pixies, and interesting enough, a whole bunch of goats. The reason for this whole scenario is that several redcaps came to harass these pixies. The pixies cast polymorph on the redcaps, and thankfully the redcaps dropped their weapons before they were polymorphed, so all of these goats have a whole bunch of sickles by their side. Once your players start talking to the pixies, they'll of course regale this whole tale, and then your players have the choice of what they want to do. Do they want to tackle these redcaps and try and beat them up? Do they want to steal these weapons away and make sure that the redcaps don't have a sickle in hand? How are your players going to approach it? It's entirely up to them, right? After 10 minutes of your players arriving at the scene, that is when the redcaps are going to snap back out of their polymorph. In which case, that is when the several different scenarios are going to play out. If your players did not take any of the sickles, the redcaps may just take up their sickles and start attacking. If your players did take their sickles, then the redcaps are going to say, hey, give us those things back. If your players do give the sickles back, then they may just decide to attack. And if your players do not give the sickles back, then they're going to stomp away into the forest. But the good thing is while yes, redcaps are actually incredibly deadly, especially if there's 3 of them and you have a lower level party, there is a whole bunch of these pixies here, and you could just have a single round of combat essentially because there are so many pixies that they would just all cast polymorph on all of these redcaps, and that would easily shut down the combat. Once the redcap whole dilemma has been dealt with, then your players may be able to talk a little bit more with these pixies, and the pixies can talk all about how the redcaps appear when Granny Nightshade took over the forest, and how the hag grows these redcaps, and how this poor grandfather oak tree is sickened by the hag's presence, and your players need to get rid of Granny Nightshade in order for this tree to become healthy again. If your players do come back here after dealing with Granny Nightshade, then the tree is actually doing a lot better, which is pretty cute. Now, while this one scenario is actually pretty cute, the problem is you're going to have everybody in the party say, hey, join us when we attack because your polymorph spells are going to be awesome and OP. In which case, you have to come up with a way for these pixies not to come, unless you want them to come, and then they just polymorph everything in sight. But you definitely have to say something along the lines of maybe the pixies have to stay to defend the tree. Maybe the pixies are deathly afraid of Granny Nightshade because she has spells that can swat them out of the sky. You have to come up with a plausible reason why these pixies aren't going to join in on the fight, because if there's a whole bunch of pixies and they can polymorph things, then it might throw the balance off of many encounters. Next up, we have Jabberwok Trail. As your players are marching around, there they see the trail of a large footprint. If anybody makes a DC 20 nature check, they know that it belongs to some dragon-like creature. So if your players have not heard anything at all about the Jabberwok, they may think that this is a dragon because guess what? We're playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? Your players also might have heard rumors, potentially, that there is a dragon at Loomlurch, and your players might try and put 2 and 2 together there. But if your players do get told at some point that there is a Jabberwok floating around this land, then hey, there is definitely that. And of course, once your players do get to Loom Lurch and find out that the dragon there is super tiny, then they're definitely going to rule that out. Now, what might potentially happen is you might have those nerds that say, oh, my character knows everything about dragons because they're, you know, a dragon hunter, or they've got affinity with dragons, or whatever. In which case, I would say that if they make a good nature check, whether that be that DC 20 or maybe even higher if you want, you could say that, oh, it's dragon-like, but it's not like any dragon you've ever seen, because presumably your players have never come across a Jabberwok because it just got printed, unless you are running your own homebrew stuff, and, you know, props to you. But I would make sure that the Jabberwok definitely feels special, and maybe you can hint at it throughout the entirety of this adventure, and this is a great way to go about hinting at it. And now on to Owlbear and Chariot. As your players look around the corner, there they see an owlbear that's strapped to a chariot, and we actually do get some cool art for that. And what your players discover is that the person that was manning this chariot was obviously ripped off. If your players look, they can see that there is some claw marks, and once again, this does tie into the Jabberwok. So your players will see an owlbear and think to themselves, oh, perfect, a pet. But here's the problem with an owlbear pet. You gotta feed the thing. So your players do have to go through the rigmarole of feeding this thing non-stop in order for it to stay with them. So while yes, the owlbear traditionally needs to be fed at least 8 pounds of meat every day to keep her docile, I think that a lot of people are going to try to make the argument of good berry as being sufficient. I would say no, because it wants to eat meat. It doesn't want to eat some stupid berry. So if you players do try and keep this thing, they have to come up with, where are they going to come up with all this meat, right? It's probably not going to happen. They may be able to keep this owlbear good for a day or two, but unless they start going all murder hobo happy and murdering a whole bunch of things, then they're probably not going to be able to keep the owlbear around. Which is, once again, you know, more of a balance thing. If you do want this adventure to all be about your players getting this humongous posse behind them of all these fun NPCs and pets and whatever else, then hey, sky's the limit. An owlbear joining the party is another great way to go about it. And lastly, for random encounters, we have Pixies yet again, but these Pixies are not tied to the tree. So your players come across a scene where there's Pixies at a tiny table and sipping tea and nibbling cake, and they are sitting next to a doorstop, but they are discussing and debating about what this doorstop actually is. If your players do tell them what the doorstop is actually for, then they're going to be extremely disappointed. But if your players come up with something fun and creative, then they're going to be delightfully happy. Either way, the debate is over, and they will give the party a reed whistle. And this reed whistle essentially acts as a conjure woodland beings, except that it doesn't summon any random things. It summons these 3 named Pixies. Now, this is a one-time use, and my goodness, could this be an absolute game changer? It will be a game changer, I absolutely promise you. No matter what instance your players decide to use this, summoning 3 Pixies is going to make or break encounters. Because Pixies, while incredibly weak individually, the thing is, as we mentioned before, they have that polymorph spell. And if you have 3 casts of polymorph, and even if it's only a DC 12, if you have 3 casts of polymorph on any one particular villain, that is likelihood of them failing. So your players do need to respect that and think to themselves, okay, we've got this powerful ability to summon these 3 friends that can cast polymorph on somebody. When are we going to use it? Your players may decide to use it right away against this hag right here in Loom Lurch. They may decide to hold on to the very end, or if they do what many gamers do, they simply have it in their pocket and refuse to ever use it because they never like using consumables. If you do have those players, by the way, if you have players that whenever you give them any sort of consumable item, they never use it because they're always trying to hoard onto it forever and all the time, then what I would strongly suggest is have the Pixies say, hey, for the next 8 days, we will allow ourselves to be summoned, and this is a one-time use. So you put that on a timer and say, hey, you know, you can only use it during this time. You can't use it anywhere else. Make sure you use it for this adventure. And just like that, we have the random encounters. So something I want to discuss about these random encounters is we see in this book, there is constant mentions of 3s and 8s. And the reason for that is because it's tied to the Fae, you know, 3s and 8s, those are the rules. But the thing you got to consider is a lot of that is DM facing, and while it's good for us for a little bit, quite frankly, it's unnecessary. With only 8 random encounters, that does mean that there is a time limit on how many random encounters you can essentially have because you keep rolling the same ones. So feel free to add more, right? You don't need to stick to the rule of 8 and rule of 3 for things that only pertain to you, right? Also, some things I want to cover in Thither is your players are undoubtedly going to ask what this huge tower is, right? There is this humongous tower that, you know, per the scale, rises high to the sky. Your players are going to ask about what that is, and what I would say is, if you want to come up with something, come up with something. It could be a lot of things. It could be maybe Zybilna erected that when she came into power. Maybe the hags put that thing when it came into power. I would say that you should probably lean in on maybe that thing is really ancient and old, and maybe part of something so old and sacred nobody even remembers what it is anymore. Maybe have something tied alongside with that. In addition to that, up here in the north here, we got a beach. It does look like your players can follow this river and make their way to what appears to be a beach. And we get no mention in this entire adventure at all about what the beaches are like. I would make them feel fantastical and whimsical. I'd make it feel awesome. I'd make it feel unique. Maybe you have some fun encounters there. Maybe there is some sand methods that are playing volleyball at the party. Maybe there is some weird fey sea creatures that go off to sea, and if your players try and chase off, then they get told to return because the seas are dangerous. There is a lot of fun things you can have there. Remember that the maps are not entirely accurate. The maps are not supposed to be the way. And also, I'm looking at the map too. I know a lot of people are going to be like, okay, what's that floating rock thing there? Because players are always obsessed with floating rocks, right? You know, whatever it is that you know that your players are going to be questioning on, make sure you have the answer in the back of your head. And if you don't necessarily care, then just say, hey, you know, maybe who knows? Maybe you'll have to figure out a way to climb up there. And maybe that's a whole quest right there, right? Maybe your players trying to figure out how to get to the top of this floating rock. You know, just make sure that you know your players, and if you don't know your players, then show them this map and figure out what the heck they're going to do, because they are presumably going to do quite a lot. That's going to do it for the Thither overview. There is a lot of fun things we had here, but next time we'll be covering the named locations, specifically Nib's Cave, the Wayward Pool, Little Oak, and a little bit of Loom Lurch. But that will be next time. So go ahead and tell me, how do you feel about Thither? Do you like the forest biome, or do you prefer the swamp biome we had before? How do you like the map? Do you like the weird little odd things? Do you like the light that's being filed through that little crack in the rock right there? Or do you think that these things distract from the main adventure? And are your players going to arrive at the named locations in any order, or are you just going to have them wing it? Go ahead and tell me those things, because I would love to hear it. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.